By the end of this lesson, you should be able to define the concept of mens rea and its significance in establishing criminal liability, and identify the types of mens rea, including intent, direct and indirect, recklessness, and negligence. You should also be able to understand the principle of transferred malice and understand that the actus reus and the mens rea must coincide. The mens rea, Latin for guilty mind, refers to the mental element or state of mind required for a defendant to be held criminally liable. It signifies the intent or knowledge of wrongdoing when committing a criminal act. Mens rea is usually required to establish criminal liability. It ensures that individuals are not punished for accidental or unintended actions. However, there are certain crimes, such as strict liability or absolute liability, where mens rea is not required. These will be covered in the next lesson. The mens rea of any criminal offence will be found in its definition, either in statute or common law. For example, the mens rea of murder is intent to kill someone or intent to cause someone grievous bodily harm. There are three main types of mens rea: intent, recklessness, and negligence. Direct intent is where the defendant's aim or purpose is to bring about a specific consequence. In cases of direct intent, the defendant acts with the clear objective of achieving the result, regardless of whether it is something the defendant actually desires or not. The case authority for this definition is R. v. Mohan. Here, a police officer signalled the defendant to stop his car. Instead of stopping, the defendant accelerated towards the officer, causing him to jump out of the way. The defendant was charged with attempting to cause bodily harm. The court held that the defendant's intent to cause harm could be inferred from his deliberate action of driving at the officer. His aim was to achieve the prohibited consequence of harm. This case clarified that the defendant's purpose must align with the result, but it is irrelevant whether they desired the outcome or not. Indirect intent, also called oblique intent, is when the defendant does not aim to bring about a specific consequence as their primary purpose, but foresees that the outcome is a virtually certain result of their actions. It is a two-part test and involves asking two questions. The first is, was the consequence of the defendant's actions of virtual certainty? The second is, did the defendant appreciate that this was the case? If both elements are satisfied, the jury may find that the defendant intended the consequence, but they do not have to. In R. v. Woolen, the defendant, frustrated with his baby's crying, threw the child onto a hard surface. The baby died as a result of the injuries. The defendant argued he did not intend to kill or cause serious harm. The court established the two-part test for oblique intent, where the two following questions are considered by the jury. In Woolen, the jury concluded that the defendant must have foreseen death or serious injury as virtually certain, satisfying oblique intent. In the case of Matthews and Elaine, the defendants threw the victim into a river, knowing he could not swim. They left him to drown and the victim died. The defendants were convicted of murder. The defendants argued that they did not intend to kill the victim, claiming their primary purpose was not to cause death. The court confirmed that foresight of virtual certainty is not the same as intent. However, it is strong evidence from which a jury may infer intent. In other words, if the two-part test is satisfied, the jury may infer intent if they believe it reflects the defendant's mental state, but they do not have to. A person is reckless if they are aware that there is a risk of something happening or a situation existing, and despite knowing about the risk, they unreasonably decide to take it. This test is subjective, not objective. This means that it assesses what the defendant believed in the circumstances, not what the reasonable person would have believed. If you are found to not have been aware of a risk, then you will not be found reckless, no matter how obvious it was. The case authority for recklessness was established in the case of R. v. G. Here, two boys, aged 11 and 12, set fire to newspapers under a wheelie bin near a shop. They believed the fire would burn out, but it spread, causing extensive damage to the building. The boys were charged with arson, which required proof of recklessness as to causing damage. The question was whether the boys could be found reckless when they did not foresee the risk due to their age and lack of understanding. The court ruled that recklessness should be assessed subjectively, focusing on whether the defendant was aware of the risk and unreasonably disregarded it. The boys were acquitted because they did not foresee the risk of significant damage consistent with their age and understanding. Negligence occurs when a defendant fails to meet the standard of care expected of a reasonable person, resulting in harm. Negligence is objective. This means that, unlike intention or recklessness, negligence does not consider what the defendant was thinking at the time of the crime. It focuses on their failure to act as a reasonable person would. Negligence is judged against the standard of the hypothetical, reasonable person in the same circumstances, regardless of the defendant's actual state of mind. If the defendant's conduct falls below this standard and causes harm, they may be found criminally negligent. In criminal law, negligence must often be gross to establish liability. This means the defendant's breach of duty must be so severe that it warrants criminal punishment. For example, gross negligence manslaughter occurs when a person's conduct is so reckless or careless that it demonstrates a disregard for the life and safety of others, resulting in death. Unlike other forms of mens rea, negligence does not require the defendant to intend harm or even foresee the risk. Transferred malice applies when a defendant intends to harm one person but unintentionally harms another. The intent is transferred to the actual victim, allowing the defendant to be held criminally liable for the unintended harm. The case authority for this is the case of Latimer. Here the defendant aimed a blow with a belt at one person during an argument. The belt ricocheted and struck a bystander, injuring them. The court held that the defendant's intent to harm the original target was transferred to the bystander. He was held liable for the injury caused to the unintended victim. Transferred malice operates only if the intended and actual harm involved the same type of offence. This principle was established in the case of Pembleton. Here, the defendant threw a stone intending to hit a person, but it instead broke a window. The doctrine of transferred malice did not apply because the intent to harm a person could not be transferred to the act of damaging property. The offences were different in nature. The principle of coincidence, also called contemporaneity, requires that the actus reus and mens rea of a crime occur at the same time for criminal liability to be established. However, courts have interpreted the requirement of coincidence flexibly to ensure justice. They allow a continuing act or a single transaction to link mens rea and actus reus, even if they do not strictly coincide. In the case of Fagan v. Metropolitan Police Commissioner, the defendant accidentally drove onto a police officer's foot and refused to move the car after realising it. The court treated the act of driving onto the foot as a continuing act. This allowed the mens rea, formed when he refused to move, to coincide with the actus reus of leaving the car on the officer's foot. In the case of Thabo Meli, the defendants attacked a man intending to kill him. Believing he was dead, they threw his body off a cliff. The man later died from exposure, rather than the initial attack. The court treated the series of actions as a single transaction. The mens rea, intent to kill, was present during this, so sufficient coincidence was established. To access the PowerPoints that I use in my videos, as well as other valuable resources such as case overviews, revision summaries, mock exams, and many others, visit my test store.